Police officers appeared outside the Cotton Club in Los Angeles like shadows materializing from smoke. It was March 1931, and Louis Armstrong, already famous, already a household name in jazz circles, was standing in the parking lot with his drummer Vic Burton, passing a marijuana cigarette between them. They were laughing, relaxed, coming down from the adrenaline of performance. And then the flashlights, the badges, the handcuffs. Louis Armstrong was arrested for marijuana possession. He would spend 9 days in jail, and in that moment, in that absurd collision between a plant that had been criminalized only a decade earlier and a musician who used it daily without harm, a story began that would stretch across 90 years. Because Louis Armstrong never stopped using marijuana, never apologized for it, never believed it should be illegal. And in 2026, as states continue to debate legalization, as the exact same arguments Louis made in 1931 are still being argued, his arrest stands as a reminder that sometimes being on the right side of history means being on the wrong side of the law, and that the gap between those two things can take generations to close. Louis had started using marijuana in the 1920s, introduced to it by musicians in New Orleans and Chicago who called it gauge, or mez, or muggles depending on their circles. For Louis, marijuana was medicine. It helped with the stress of constant performance, helped him sleep after late-night shows, helped manage the anxiety that came from being a black performer in a white-dominated industry that could turn hostile without warning. But more than that, Louis genuinely enjoyed it. He loved the way it made him feel, the way it enhanced his appreciation of music, the way it helped him relax in a life that rarely allowed for relaxation. He used it the way other people used alcohol, except Louis noticed something crucial. Marijuana didn't make him aggressive or sloppy or sick the next morning. It didn't impair his performance. It enhanced his ability to be present, to appreciate the moment, to find joy in circumstances that might otherwise feel overwhelming. The laws against marijuana were recent and, in Louis's view, completely arbitrary. Cannabis had been legal for most of American history. People had used it medicinally and recreationally without significant social problems. But in the 1920s, as part of the broader prohibition movement and influenced by racial fear-mongering that associated marijuana with Mexican immigrants and black jazz musicians, states began criminalizing it. By 1930, marijuana was illegal in most states, including California. The laws weren't based on scientific evidence of harm. They were based on moral panic and racist assumptions about who used marijuana and what that said about their character. Louis understood this, understood that marijuana prohibition was less about public health and more about control, about criminalizing behaviors associated with communities that white America feared or wanted to suppress. He'd watched alcohol prohibition fail spectacularly, breeding organized crime and government corruption while doing nothing to reduce drinking. And now the same government was prohibiting marijuana, a substance Louis considered far less harmful than alcohol. The hypocrisy infuriated him, but fury didn't change the law. And on that March night in 1931, the law found Louis Armstrong in a parking lot with a marijuana cigarette. The arrest was humiliating and terrifying in ways that had nothing to do with the substance itself. Louis was a black man in 1931 America, being arrested by white police officers in a city where being black and famous didn't protect you from violence or injustice. The officers who arrested him could have beaten him, could have fabricated additional charges, could have made the situation far worse than it was. That they didn't was fortune, not justice. Louis spent 9 days in the Los Angeles County Jail, a facility overcrowded with people whose crimes ranged from murder to marijuana possession, all of them processed through a system that made little distinction between genuine danger and arbitrary prohibition. In jail, Louis had time to think about the absurdity of being imprisoned for something that harmed no one, about the fact that alcohol, which he'd seen destroy lives and families, was on its way to being legal again after prohibition's repeal, while marijuana, which Louis had never seen harm anyone in any comparable way, remained criminalized. About the fact that the same country that imprisoned him for marijuana would gladly accept his tax money, his performances for white audiences, his service as cultural ambassador. The contradictions were stark and impossible to ignore. When Louis was released after 9 days, having paid his fine and served his time, a normal person might have decided the risk wasn't worth it, might have stopped using marijuana, frightened by the experience of arrest and incarceration. But Louis wasn't interested in normal caution. He was interested in what he believed was right, and he believed marijuana prohibition was wrong, unjust, based on lies and racism rather than evidence or reason. So Louis went back to using marijuana, not defiantly exactly, but matter-of-factly. He liked it. It helped him. It wasn't hurting anyone, and the fact that the government had decided to criminalize it didn't change any of those facts. For the next 40 years, until his death in 1971, Louis Armstrong used marijuana nearly every day. He called it gauge with affection, the way someone might refer to a beloved friend. He'd smoke before shows, after shows, during downtime on tour. It became part of his routine, his self-care, his way of managing the demands of a career that required constant travel, constant performance, constant presence in a world that was often hostile to black excellence. And he talked about it, not publicly in ways that would get him arrested again, but privately with friends, with other musicians, with people he trusted. He'd explain his philosophy. Marijuana was harmless, alcohol was dangerous, the law was backwards, and eventually society would realize its mistake. The FBI noticed, of course they noticed. J. Edgar Hoover's bureau was obsessed with black artists and activists, convinced that anyone who challenged social norms was potentially subversive. Louis Armstrong's FBI file, which would eventually span hundreds of pages, included detailed documentation of his marijuana use. Agents would note when he was seen with known marijuana users, would document rumors about his possession, would track his statements about drug policy. The government that had arrested him once continued surveilling him for decades, treating his marijuana use as evidence of moral corruption rather than what it actually was, a middle-aged man using a plant that helped him manage stress. In the 1960s, as social attitudes began slowly shifting, as young people began questioning drug prohibition and the counterculture emerged, Louis became more open about his views. In interviews, he'd mention his marijuana use, not flaunting it but not hiding it either. He'd say things like, "I've smoked gauge for 40 years and it never hurt me, never made me violent or sick, but alcohol, I've seen alcohol destroy people. Tear families apart, and that's legal while gauge is criminal. That doesn't make sense." The interviewers, often shocked by his candor, would ask if he wasn't afraid of being arrested again. Louis would shrug. "I'm an old man. What are they going to do? I'm telling the truth. Someone needs to." What Louis understood in 1931, what he articulated throughout his life. What many people are only now accepting in 2026 is that marijuana prohibition was never about public health. It was about control, about criminalizing communities, particularly black and brown communities, that white America wanted to suppress. The war on drugs that would officially launch in the 1970s after Louis's death would prove him right in the most devastating ways. Millions of people, disproportionately black and brown, imprisoned for marijuana possession. Lives ruined, families destroyed, all for a substance that study after study would show was less harmful than legal alcohol. The arguments Louis made in the 1930s are the same arguments activists make today. That marijuana prohibition is unjust, that it causes more harm than the substance itself, that the law is applied selectively, targeting marginalized communities while often ignoring use in white, wealthy populations. That personal freedom includes the right to consume substances that don't harm others. That government prohibition of marijuana is government overreach built on racist foundations. Louis didn't have the academic language or the research studies that modern advocates cite, but he had something more powerful: direct experience, 40 years of using marijuana without harm. 40 years of watching alcohol destroy lives while marijuana was criminalized. 40 years of knowing the law was wrong. In 2026, marijuana is legal in many states for both medical and recreational use. In other states, it remains criminalized, with people still being arrested, still serving time, still having their lives disrupted for possession of a substance that is demonstrably less dangerous than alcohol or tobacco. The patchwork of laws across America means that what's legal in California is still criminal in Texas. That you can be a law-abiding citizen in one state and a criminal if you cross state lines. This absurdity, this geographic lottery of criminalization, is exactly what Louis experienced in 1931. He knew marijuana wasn't harmful. Millions of people knew it. But the law said otherwise, and the law had power regardless of whether it had logic. The movement toward legalization that has gained momentum in the 21st century would have pleased Louis, but it also would have frustrated him, because it took so long. because millions of people were imprisoned in the decades between his arrest and current reforms, because the same country that arrested him in 1931 is now making billions in tax revenue from legal marijuana sales while often refusing to expunge the criminal records of people imprisoned for marijuana offenses before legalization. Louis would have seen that hypocrisy clearly, would have understood that legalization without justice for those previously criminalized is incomplete progress. The story of Louis Armstrong's marijuana arrest matters not because he was a celebrity who got caught. It matters because his experience illuminates the arbitrary nature of drug prohibition, the racist foundations of drug laws, and the long gap between when thoughtful people understand a law is unjust and when society finally changes that law. Louis knew in 1931 that marijuana prohibition was wrong. He knew it based on personal experience, based on observing that marijuana didn't cause the harms alcohol caused, based on understanding that the law was being selectively applied to criminalize behaviors associated with black communities. And he was right. Decades of research have confirmed what Louis knew from experience. Marijuana is less addictive than alcohol, less associated with violence, less damaging to physical health. The primary harm from marijuana comes not from the substance itself but from prohibition, the arrests, the incarceration, the criminal records that follow people for life and limit their employment, housing, and opportunities. Louis understood this, lived it. Spent 9 days in jail for possessing a substance that harmed no one, and then spent the rest of his life quietly insisting the law was wrong, even when that insistence put him at risk of further arrest. There's courage in that, not the dramatic courage of revolution or protest, though Louis showed that kind of courage too when he spoke out about Little Rock, but the everyday courage of believing something unpopular, of refusing to accept unjust laws even when obeying them would be safer, of trusting your own experience over conventional wisdom. Louis Armstrong knew marijuana prohibition was unjust in 1931, and he lived accordingly. Consequences be damned. That's principled defiance. That's being on the right side of history, even when it means being on the wrong side of the law. The FBI file on Louis Armstrong's marijuana use reveals how much government resources were dedicated to surveilling a man whose crime was using a plant that helped him sleep. The irony is thick. The government that should have been protecting Louis Armstrong from actual threats instead spent decades monitoring his marijuana use, treating him like a criminal, maintaining files that suggested he was potentially subversive because he used a substance that millions of people use without harm. That surveillance, that waste of resources, that criminalization of something harmless, all of it vindicates Louis's position. The government was wrong, Louis was right, and it only took 90 years for society to start catching up. In his final years, Louis would sometimes talk about that night in 1931, the arrest, the jail time, the humiliation of being criminalized for something he knew wasn't wrong. But he'd also talk about his decision to keep using marijuana anyway, not because he was reckless or didn't understand the risks, but because he believed in something larger than temporary safety. He believed in truth, in the right to make decisions about your own body when those decisions don't harm others, in refusing to accept unjust laws just because accepting them would be easier. Louis Armstrong was arrested for marijuana in 1930, and he never apologized, never stopped, never accepted that the law was right just because it was the law. That's the story we need to remember in 2026, as marijuana legalization continues to advance state by state but remains criminalized federally and in many places locally. That the current legal status of marijuana isn't based on scientific evidence of harm. It's based on politics, on historical racism, on the slow grinding process of changing laws that never should have existed in the first place. Louis Armstrong knew this in 1931, used marijuana anyway, went to jail, got out, used it again for 40 more years, until he died in 1971 on the right side of history but still on the wrong side of federal law. The final irony is that Louis Armstrong's marijuana use, which got him arrested, which subjected him to FBI surveillance, which was used as evidence of his moral corruption, actually helped him become the artist he was, helped him manage the stress of constant performance, helped him stay present and appreciative in a life that could easily have become overwhelming, helped him maintain his creativity and joy despite facing racism, exploitation, and demands that would have broken lesser people. Marijuana didn't make Louis Armstrong great, his talent did that. But marijuana helped Louis Armstrong manage the challenges of greatness, helped him maintain the disposition and presence that made his performances so powerful. And the government arrested him for it, called it criminal, surveilled him for it, treated it as evidence of deviance rather than what it was, a man finding a harmless way to cope with extraordinary pressure. That arrest in 1931 wasn't justice, it was persecution, and Louis knew it, lived with that knowledge, never let it change his behavior or his beliefs. That's integrity, that's moral courage, that's being right before the world is ready to admit it. 90 years later, some of America has caught up to where Louis Armstrong was in 1931. Some states have legalized marijuana, recognizing that prohibition causes more harm than use. But some haven't. Some people are still being arrested for what Louis did. Still serving time, still having their lives disrupted by laws that are as unjust now as they were in 1931. The gap between states proves Louis's point. If marijuana criminalization was about public safety, it would be uniform. The fact that it's geographical proves it's political, proves it's about control, not health, proves Louis was right, the man who was arrested for marijuana in 1930 was right about marijuana prohibition, right in 1930, right in 1960, right in 2000, right in 2026. And probably will still be proven right in 2050, when hopefully the entire country will have caught up to what Louis knew from experience, what research has confirmed, what justice demands, that marijuana prohibition is unjust, that it causes more harm than the substance itself, that it has always been about criminalizing communities rather than protecting public health. Louis Armstrong, arrested for marijuana in 1930, never apologized, never stopped. Never accepted that being on the wrong side of the law meant being on the wrong side of history. And history, slowly, painfully, with millions harmed in the interim, is proving him right. That's the story, not just about marijuana, but about knowing truth when you see it, about refusing to accept unjust laws even when the cost is high, about being principled enough to live according to your beliefs even when doing so could get you arrested. Louis Armstrong did that for 40 years, and he was right. The law was wrong, is still wrong in many places, but Louis was right in 1930 and forever after.